Awesome. Thank you so much, Alyssa. I appreciate all of that. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you join us today for this webinar. We're really excited to get to present. We have some amazing speakers. I'm really excited for you to get to hear what they have to say. We're especially excited to be able to put on this webinar with the upcoming Safe Harbor effective date on October 1st. I know a lot of you are working in the field, and it's been long awaited for Safe Harbor to come into effect. So we're really thrilled to be able to put on this presentation in anticipation of that celebration of that law. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Like I said, we have three great speakers today. First, we'll be hearing from Jewell Copeland, who has a master's in social work and is the Baltimore City Human Trafficking Regional Navigator, as well as the Center for Hope's Anti-Trafficking and Exploitation Program Supervisor. We will then be hearing from Liz Kimbel, who is the Maryland Regional Director at the Restoring Ivy Collective. And then finally, we will be hearing from Dr. Beth Bowman, the Assistant Professor of Social Work at Gallaudet University and the CEO of the Restoring Ivy Collective. They have a lot of great personal experience to share and professional experience. So we're just really excited to get to share their work with you. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Jewell.
Thank you, Natalie, for that wonderful introduction. I agree, it's very exciting that Safe Harbor will be coming in effect as of October 1st. I would love to just speak with you guys briefly about the Regional Navigator program, exactly what that is and how it is supporting trafficking cases here in Baltimore City, as well as a service that we provide to our child trafficking cases here in Baltimore City, which is our child trafficking MDT. So starting with the Regional Navigator program, the Regional Navigator program was brought into effect by Governor Hogan. He signed it into law in 2019. This law requires that law enforcement agents, local departments of social services who have suspect that a child may be a victim of trafficking should notify a regional navigator within their jurisdiction. This regional navigator really sits in the space of being a bridge between that client, that victim, their family, and the services that they are provided within the city, whether that be a bridge between the family and the detective on their case, a bridge between that family and any victim advocates on that case. That regional navigator has the ability to be privy to the knowledge of what's happening on that child's case and be privy to have that direct line of communication with that child's service providers. One thing that I've learned being in the space as a regional navigator is that I have been able to connect with various service providers throughout Baltimore City within the realm of State's Attorney's Office, DJS, Baltimore Police Department, and really be able to build a good rapport with those various service providers to be able to learn when a child trafficking case comes about and how we can best service it and really surround that family and make sure that they're supported. Another wonderful thing about being a regional navigator and being within Baltimore City is being able to be seated at a child advocacy center. Again, as a regional navigator, my role is really to sit and bridge that gap between the client and their services that they are being provided. By sitting at a child advocacy center, I am also privy to any of those child abuse cases that are coming through the Child Advocacy Center in Baltimore City. That means that any case that comes into the Child Advocacy Center, I am able to have my eyes on it, assess, and look for any signs of trafficking, any signs of exploitation to make sure that we are doing our best to service any child victim within Baltimore City. With that being said, I would love to talk more about how I am able to have my eyes on those cases and assess for any signs of trafficking or exploitation. And that is because I attend the CAC's Child Maltreatment Multidisciplinary Team Meeting. A multidisciplinary team meeting, for those of you who may not be working in the field or have never heard of it or just need a refresher, is a team of collaborative diverse service providers that come together and really discuss the best way to service child victims or survivors of any traumatization that is happening to them and their family. So this can include, again, different service provided from government sectors or child advocacy victim services. By sitting on the child maltreatment MDT within the Child Advocacy Center, having my eyes on it, I'm able to assess for any signs of exploitation, extortion, trafficking, and then I bring it to our child trafficking MDT, which is that same process of having a collaborative discussion, but with child trafficking specific service providers. It's been a great service that we've been able to provide within Baltimore City to all of our child trafficking cases. I want to share with you guys some of the people that do attend this child trafficking MDT, just so that you can get an idea about exactly what expertise is able to sit in this MDT and offer support and services to make sure that the family feels supported in every way or form. So this child trafficking MDT includes Baltimore PD. So these are partners that are either detectives, sometimes they are the sergeant, sometimes they're the victim services personnel within the human trafficking unit. They can also be from other specialized units, such as missing persons or VICE. We have people from Department of Social Services sitting on this MDT. That could include a child social worker if one is involved, their supervisor, the Department of Social Services, Child Protection Services, screening supervisor, to make sure that any cases that are coming in and being screened are appropriately assigned. We also have partners from the Department of Juvenile Services. We also include partners from the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office and other victim service providers such as Airmenta and Turnaround, which also includes Baltimore County's regional navigator because we are so closely located. By having all of these various partners in this space, in this MDT, I have found that I've really been able to build a rapport with all of these different sectors, and all these different sectors have been able to build a rapport with each other so that we can communicate and discuss if any case comes to knowledge and come to one central space and discuss the services that we're going to provide for them, whether it be what's going on in the investigation, if this child has been seen in Baltimore County before, whether or not this child has received any services through the Child Advocacy Center. It really creates a wonderful space to provide trauma-informed support for the family to make sure that nobody gets lost in the gaps. We understand that sometimes, families may have a hard time communicating with their service providers. Sometimes it's often very overwhelming for families to understand exactly what's happening or next steps. And by all of us being able to commune together in one space, we are all able to set eyes on the case, and we're all able to set eyes on the case in a way that is through our own specialized lens, and be able to really make sure that we are coming up with safety plans, that we are coming up with follow-ups, and that we are making sure that we are being effective and efficient. That's just a brief overview. I would love to answer any questions when there is the questions at the end, I believe, Natalie. So just thank you for this space to quickly explain to you all what is happening in Baltimore City, some of the great services that we've been able to provide, and how we've been able to keep our eyes on child trafficking cases. One last thing I would like to add is that the MDT model we do have an MOU in place to allow communication between all of these partners. So all communication is confidential. We're all able to know that when we do come together to share this information, it's trusted and supported. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your professional experience and the great work that you're doing in Baltimore City. I know it's really interesting to hear about the MDT group and your work as a navigator. So really appreciate that. And as Jewell said, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in either the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will have ample time at the end to address all of them. But if you think of any questions now or throughout the rest of the presentations, please just write them in the chat and we'll have time at the end. But next I want to pass it off to Liz Kimbel.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I see that we have up to 68 participants. That's pretty awesome. I was asked to speak today about the intersectionality of the criminal justice and trafficking, specifically because of the programming that I'm doing for the Restoring Ivy Collective. I've been in the anti-trafficking space for about 10 years, and I have worn many hats, including legislative work. So this upcoming Safe Harbor event is really special to me because I worked pretty hard with everyone on it, and I am so thankful that we are finally getting to a place where we see children specifically being protected from the criminal justice system as opposed to being pushed through it and further traumatized by the experience. I wanted to talk today about the programming that I do in the Baltimore jails with both survivors and people who are at high risk, and also those who may not have experienced trafficking themselves, but would be peripheral to it, as you know, it could be happening to a family member, a friend, a child. It's important that when doing the programming in the jail, we didn't ask people to self-identify due to safety concerns. So when doing the programming, I speak to the room about trafficking in a way that everyone can absorb the information and no one is put on the spot to feel the need to identify. When designing the programming that we wanted to take into the jails, we decided to use 3 different curriculums. The first being restorative chair yoga. The reason we chose chair yoga was because we knew that we would have participants who were older or participants who may have a disability or need adaptations. And we wanted to make sure that the yoga we were providing would be inclusive to everyone. We also provide an art program, which is not focused on building art skills, but rather combining social and emotional skills to the art project itself. We did this for a multitude of reasons, but the first being that we wanted the programming to be accessible to all. And we wanted to focus more on gaining life skills rather than gaining art skills. It was important to us to provide the art because we knew that there was a connection between having your hands busy doing something creative and feeling the ability to be more vulnerable or to share more or to listen more. And that moves us into our last bit of programming, which is the SMART recovery model, which we use as an alternative to the 12-step model when talking about addiction. And the reason we chose SMART recovery was also for a multitude of reasons. But most importantly, in that it tackled not just addiction of substances, but addiction of maladaptive behaviors, which we knew would be useful to all the participants in the jail. Because while not everyone suffers from an addiction to a substance, almost everyone has a maladaptive behavior, including any of us here today. And so the SMART recovery model helped to bring attention to the behavior without naming it necessarily, and providing tangible tools on how to manage it, that when used in practice over and over becomes something we have internalized and can be utilized on the spot. For example, there is a worksheet called the ABC worksheet, and it goes through 3 steps, and that's identifying an activating event, something that bothers us, a belief about the event, something that may not be logical or reasonable, but it's still a belief. You know, for instance, if you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, the cutting off is the activating event. The belief about the event is that your time is more important than someone else's, and you should be mad and you should rage behind the wheel. And then C would be the consequence to the belief. And so by putting those things down on paper and practicing them over and over in your mind, eventually you internalize it and you don't need help. You can just kind of work through those steps. And so that was a key desire in the programming we wanted to offer, was that we could provide tools that helped people manage any behavior at any point through practice and through community. And then if people do identify as survivors and they are coming out of the incarceration, they're then eligible to join our virtual support groups, which we have quite a few of. And this is kind of that wraparound that we provide in the case of someone needing more support. I came today feeling ill-prepared because I wanted to bring quantitative data about the intersectionality of the criminal justice system and trafficking. But sadly, there just isn't much to pull from. So I decided instead to share my experiences of working in the jails. And I look forward to any questions anybody has, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate you sharing your experience in working in your settings. Okay, well, next we will pass the mic off to Dr. Beth Bowman.
Hi, and I apologize for my computer issue. I recently got a new computer system, and it was updating Zoom, and then once I got on the Zoom, the bandwidth was too low. So we're just gonna do phone today. So hopefully that's okay for everybody. You can see me, okay. But yeah, so Restoring Ivy Collective is a whole bunch of us doing work in the space. I'm a survivor of domestic minor sex trafficking and CSEC across the DMV and into Baltimore and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and all of that. And I teach social work at Gallaudet University. So we do have a focus in creating, accessible spaces for people with disabilities and need for accommodation at Restoring Ivy Collective, just sort of by virtue of Liz's interest in that and mine as well. I will say that we have really 3 places that we do our programming. The Baltimore space is largely reentry, although we are expanding into additional spaces to reach out to folks. But the research really shows us that there is a lot of overlap in terms of reentry and individuals who've been exploited, particularly female and LGBT folks. And then on the DC side, our population tends to skew a little more to the younger crowd. So we have youth shelters that we do a lot of our programming in, DV shelters. We are also in the Hope Court, which is the diversion court for youth. And we're going to be expanding. Actually had to have Kyla go without me today to the youth detention center, because typically Tuesday afternoons is our youth detention center day. But so we are doing groups for the youth and really trying to build, as Liz said, that sense of community and connection. And I think, it's because trafficking itself comes with so much relational breakage, and it comes with so much sort of, if you're in the life, right, like those people are the squares and those people don't get us, and we are the counterculture ones, and we are whatever the narratives are that sort of keep you bound to that way of life. But also you learn to mistrust systems, not just because of that, right, but because the systems mistreat you and the systems don't show up for you. And when you interact with law enforcement, it's negative a lot of the time. And when you interact with social services, right, a lot of times it's being removed or having your children removed, or right, like family breakage stuff. And so you're moving through a world that is scary, and you don't know who to trust, and you don't know you don't know how to stop the floor from shaking underneath you, because that's the nature of trafficking, right, is that it is like the floor is always moving, and traffickers do that on purpose, right? They want you to have this sense of like their reality is the reality and is the only thing, which keeps you focused on keeping them happy and keeping you safe, essentially. Like that's, you stay in this fight or flight space. But when you are interacting with systems that are doing the same thing, and you don't know, like, are you going to get help or not? And is your social worker going to be the same person from one week to the next? And right, like, just so many realities of the system end up reenacting all of this relational breakage that we have experienced as survivors, and just sort of drive that point home that like, oh, well, maybe my trafficker was right, that I can't trust anybody and the world doesn't have anything for me. And then, add on top of that the shame and the stigma of sex trafficking itself, that if I tell people what happened to me, it's much less about what happened to me, but like all of the things that I did wrong, that somehow I'm complicit in all these things that happened. And then, layer on top of that, when you reach out for help and you have providers that are saying, I don't know what to do with this person because they're too difficult, or they are too prickly, or right, like they're not a deserving victim. They're not an easy to work with victim. They don't present as grateful and humble and, oh, thank you for saving me. I think just sort of as a take home for providers, like all of us here are doing work in trafficking spaces, but keeping in mind that the layers of this are deep, and knowing what to expect from a trauma-informed care lens. And that is not knowing what trauma is, but knowing how to approach a person who has trauma, right? There is very specific stuff that you should be doing. And so having a sense of that, of what that's supposed to look like, can help us be more effective. Being a survivor does not make me somehow more equipped to be trauma informed. I want to put that out there. That is not a training. What I went through was not a training. It was not a degree. It was not anything that prepared me. Like, yeah, I get stuff viscerally in a way that somebody who hasn't had to do the things I had to do, right? Like, I get that. And when we talk about evidence-based practices, which we at the Restoring Ivy Collective are really about, and a big part of that is because, so many people in our community, I was going to say parts of the Restoring Ivy Collective, like we're an arm and a leg, and, but like, so many parts of our community, people in our community have experienced breakage in working in the movement, not just in being trafficked. And so, and most of our staff are survivors. And so having somebody say, hey, I'm not equipped to do this specific intervention, means they need additional training, they need additional support, they need supervision. And maybe that's not their best approach. And we need to find, what fits them to be able to reach out and use their strengths. But evidence-based practice includes lived experience, but isn't only lived experience. And program evaluation should include staff input as well as client input, right? So if you're looking at like how we're doing, organizations need to be aware of like how their people are doing too, internally and the clients that they serve, because it's all part of this ecosystem that we work in. And so I don't know if I went off a little bit too far off the beaten path there, but you know, just to say that like we are MCASA and Restoring Ivy Collective and all of these organizations that are here in the greater DMV Baltimore region are building something essentially from scratch, because there isn't a standard that has been given to us by the feds, by research. Like there isn't like a, okay, this is the way to do it. It's being rebuilt. It's being built right now. Like we're driving the car on a road that's literally being paved like 4 feet in front of us. And so so we have an obligation to check in with each other and to be saying, okay, what's working, what's not? How do we connect and collaborate? And like, yeah, we might be competing for grants, but we still need to share information, and we need to be, you know, in the same sandbox, because like we're all driving on this road together. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you've had to say and all that insight. And I know as someone who's working in this field as well, I really appreciate all that you had to say. Yeah. So next, I'm going to share my screen and do a little brief a presentation on the Safe Harbor Act, because I know it's been referenced a lot, and we just want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page and in part of celebrating it, just explaining what it does and why we're so excited about the passage of this bill. So I'm going to talk a lot about the law. So this is why I have some slides. I have the language of the law out here, and I just want to share that with everybody. And I'll provide these as well to all the participants afterwards. So we will send those out so you can have them for your reference. And as always, if you have questions for any of the participants you've heard from so far, if you've thought of anything that you'd like to hear them talk about or address, please put it in the chat. We're going to have a lot of time for questions in just a few minutes here. So we would love to be able to engage in a greater conversation through addressing your questions. But yeah, so Safe Harbor is a bill that we've heard reference to a lot today. It's the Safe Harbor for Minor Victims of Sex Trafficking. It was filed under House Bill 297, and it was cross-filed with Senate Bill 292. There's the list of all the sponsors. We're really grateful for all the senators and delegates who, you know, took on this bill and advocated for it, as well as all the organizations. I know Liz mentioned she was a huge advocate for this bill. So all of the testimony from organizations. MCASA was also a big proponent and lobbyist for this bill, as well as Partners at Turnaround. And I'm sure many of your organizations as well were big proponents of this bill. And after many years of hard work and unfortunately some failed attempts, it was finally passed in the 2023 legislative session, and it goes into effect on October 1st. So just a few days from now, we'll start seeing the effect of Safe Harbor. In short, it's a bill that protects victims, survivors from being arrested, charged, and prosecuted for certain crimes that are a direct result of the trafficking, and also provides and ensures that they're being connected with services. So the services you heard Jewell speak about, it's ensuring that they're being connected to those. It provides immunity for a specified list of crimes. The language of the bill specifically states a minor may not be criminally prosecuted or proceeded against under certain provisions for a certain offense if the minor committed the offense as a direct result of being a victim of trafficking. The court shall dismiss the case charged for any qualifying offense or violation or offense under Section 31102, which is the human trafficking statute in Maryland law. If the court finds that the child is a victim of trafficking and committed the qualifying offense or violation as a direct result of being the victim of trafficking. So that's how the bill outlines these protections. It's for minor survivors, and it's for a qualifying offense that is the direct result of trafficking. So we have yet to see exactly how that will, play out in courts or in once it's effective, how we'll see that. But that's the language of the law. And on this next slide, this is a lot of information, but this is the entire list of all the qualifying offenses that Safe Harbor protects against. So as you can see, it's pretty extensive, and it protects from everything from possessing controlled substances to misdemeanor theft, to certain types of fraud, such as identification fraud or public assistance fraud, to a variety of driving offenses, driving with a suspended license or registration or failure to display license. So these are all the offenses that Safe Harbor protects against. If an individual is arrested for one of these and they are a victim of trafficking and the offense is a result of trafficking, they will not be charged with any of these crimes. So it's really a great protection, as many of these offenses are ones that, they might be induced to commit at the hands of the traffickers. So definitely important to protect against that. The second part of the act is what invokes the Regional Navigator program. So in addition to providing the criminal protections, it also connects survivors with services. So a law enforcement officer who believes that a child that has been detained may be a victim of trafficking must notify the appropriate regional navigator that the child is a suspected victim, and then the regional navigator can coordinate a service response that Jewell has walked us through in connecting them with either the multiple disciplinary team in the county or other services, making sure that they are receiving a response that is adequate and is meeting their needs. The law enforcement officer must also report to the local child welfare agency, and then also must release the child to the child's parents, guardian, or custodian if it's safe to do so. If it's not safe, then they release to the local welfare agency. So Safe Harbor is also, directly working with the Regional Navigator program and working in providing those connections so that survivors can receive the services that they need, instead of going through the criminal justice system and being treated like they did something wrong or are being charged and arrested. They are now being met with these services, which is a huge win for everybody I know who's working in this field. I next want to pivot a little bit. I know we've talked about the Restoring Ivy Collective and all the amazing programs that they have to offer, as well as the Regional Navigator program and the services that they have to offer. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the services that MCASA has to offer through our Sexual Assault Legal Institute, SALI, which is the legal arm of MCASA. We provide, me along with my other colleagues and staff attorneys, provide legal consultation and services to survivors of sexual assault. A large part of what we do is assist in enforcing crime victims' rights. So if somebody is a victim witness of a crime, they are afforded a variety of rights under the Maryland law. These include the right to be notified of hearings, the right to be present at hearings when the defendant is present, the right to be notified of the terms of any plea agreement that is reached between the defendant and the state's attorney. They have the right to be heard at sentencing hearings through a victim impact statement. They have the right to restitution, to request restitution as a part of the sentencing. And they also have the right to an attorney. an attorney may be able to help advocate for these rights. So that's something that we offer at Sally, and we can provide representation for. So if you are working with survivors and they are interested in, or they're going through the criminal process and prosecuting the people who harmed them, and they're interested in representation for crime victims' rights, this is something that we can offer, and that our office often does in helping survivors get the justice that they deserve. Another thing our office does is we help with the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. So we can help advocate for survivors to hear information and get notified about their kits, their safe exam kits, and get notified about decisions to test their kits or decisions to destroy their kits. So we can communicate with law enforcement throughout that process to make sure that information is being given to the survivors about their sexual assault forensic exams. We also represent survivors in peace and protective order hearings. So we can represent at those hearings and help them file the petitions as well. We represent in a variety of housing issues. If there are any sort of wanting to get out of a lease agreement or issues with the landlord, we can provide representation in circumstances like that. We also do some employment law representation. We do a limited amount of immigration representation, but we do U visa applications and T visa applications. And T visas are the visas that are eligible for survivors of trafficking. So if any of you are working with survivors who have immigration concerns, we can provide consultation and potential representation for submitting a T visa. And then we finally provide representation in family law matters, so divorce, custody, family maintenance, things like that. And then the full list, we do more than this as well. The full list can be found on our website. I believe Alyssa's putting a link in the chat. But if you are working with anybody who is hoping to have some legal representation in any of these areas, please call us. Our number is there. It's 301-565-2277. We'd love to be able to potentially to give a consultation and potentially represent them and provide that legal assistance. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and jump out here. So now we're going to go into the Q&A portion of the panel of this webinar. So if we could bring back all the presenters. Let me see if we have any questions in the chat. If you think of anything, please continue to put it in the chat. But to start us off, it looks like we have a question for Jewell. So the question asks, are there any language access issues? Are families being provided an overview of services in their own native language? Yeah, this is the question for our regional navigator.
Thank you. It really does depend on the language. For now, we are able to help provide assistance to our Spanish-speaking clients and families. And again, that's just one of the beauties about being in that CT and DT and having those connections as a regional navigator. We can bring those concerns, of a language barrier to the table, and all of our partners that are present are able to brainstorm other ways or other services or victim services to support the family in their native language as best as possible.
Great, thank you. And then to add on, I know that question was for Jewell, but Sally also offers language. We can do intakes in Spanish. We have Spanish speaking advocates who can communicate with clients in Spanish. And then we also have access to a language line that provides services so that we can have translation available for other languages as well. And I wonder if Dr. Beth or Liz, you want to talk about maybe some of the language options you have through Restoring IV in your work.
Yeah, so if you have deaf participants that are in need of victim services specifically, or just a peer advocate to be present, I'm fluent in sign language. I am not a sign language interpreter. I repeat. If you need someone to translate, if you need an interpreter, you're going to have to call an interpreting agency. I would encourage you to call the RID, which is the Registry of the Interpreters for the Deaf. So you get somebody that's certified, not somebody that doesn't actually know the language. So very, very important to make sure that you get certified interpreters. But if you need services, direct services for somebody who's deaf, we do not provide therapy, but we do have support groups. And we have spaces for intake and can get folks connected to deaf serving agencies, both here and nationally as needed.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, so I see a question in the chat that is for Sally. Did the assault need to occur in Maryland? So for our clients, the assault doesn't necessarily need to occur in Maryland, but there does have to be a nexus to Maryland. So sometimes that looks like the client living in Maryland or the perpetrator living in Maryland. Oftentimes it does look like the assault occurring in Maryland, but if the client lives in Maryland, that can also be a nexus, but there does have to be some nexus to Maryland for us to provide services. So thank you for that question. Just checking the chat here. Like I said, please continue throwing questions in there and we'll get to as many as we can. I have a question for everyone. I wonder if you could share a little bit about what you see as one of or some of the best resources you've come across in your work that may be useful to others working in this field. If there's any really helpful resources, or I know you spoke about different different groups or collaborations, but any resources that you've come across that have really assisted in your work that you'd like to share.
So I have a couple that I think are really particularly great. I would love to spotlight You Are More Than in New Jersey, run by Ashanti Taylor Cox. They focus on serving BIPOC survivors. They are survivor-led. They also focus on LGBT survivors, and all of their virtual support groups are open gender. Most of our support groups are serving female identifying people. So that includes trans women, but it is majority female identifying folks. And so I would say that's a really, really great resource. I would also say if you're looking for survivors to consult on projects, Shabana Powell Consulting has a pretty good consultancy pool, and they do a lot of research in the space as well. Recently we discovered that OVC will do training for task forces for free. So, worth connecting to the training and technical arm of OVC, because they will do they'll do free trainings for anybody that needs them. And they have a pool of folks that they pay to come and do that. They handle the tech, they handle everything. So if you need free training, they are a great resource. And they also have survivors in their consultancy pool.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that.
For Baltimore City, the victim services organizations that we utilize and that we are really aware of are Turnaround, Araminta. They also service human trafficking survivors, as well as the Center for Hope. We do have our anti-trafficking program there with case management and advocacy support. And one of the benefits of all of those three organizations is that they do participate on the NDT. So, we are able to discuss if a youth was previously involved in turnaround and say is now coming in through Center for Hope, we can redirect that case back to the original case manager, back to the original advocate, to make sure that there's some sort of consistency and continued rapport building for that youth and the family.
Oh, that's awesome. Dr. Beth, I wonder if you would mind putting those resources that you mentioned in the chat. We had a request to repeat them, but it might be easier if you could just throw them in the chat for us. Awesome, thank you. Liz, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? Any specifics that you've come across or no? Great. We have another question that is asking about whether there are any outreach efforts being made to educate law enforcement more about human trafficking. They say, I know they do receive training. However, it seems like law enforcement continues to need more training. So I'll open that up to the group. Whoever wants to jump in there, feel free to take that.
I am not sure about direct trainings that may have happened or are continuing to happen, but I do know that Maryland does have a human trafficking collaborative, which includes a law enforcement committee, and they do meet to discuss, human trafficking needs and improvements in policy and work within the law enforcement realm. I also sit on that committee as well. So it's really great that they are incorporating, a regional navigator who does have access to service providers and clients and families to bring that voice into their committee. And I've seen law enforcement, human trafficking detectives, victim services providers really show up in some of the spaces that we have been providing to support the family in the best way we can, or at least to communicate with those service providers that are communicating with the families, to make sure that they are getting any information from law enforcement in a way that is trauma-informed, in a way that is client-centered. I have noticed that happening here in Baltimore City.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too to say that MCASA provides training opportunities for we do training requests. So if you reach out to MCASA with a request for training, we can provide that. Oftentimes, that does include or can include law enforcement. So we've done trainings like that in the past and can continue to do trainings like that. But I agree. I think it's definitely something that needs to happen more often, and we'd love to provide that if we can, if there's a request for that. Okay, we have a comment here in the chat too, adding to the conversation, which is great, saying that law enforcement is also being trained by counties through different initiatives. So this one says, for example, in Montgomery County, law enforcement is being trained through the Maryland Safe Bypass Initiative at the Shady Grove Adventist Hospital. So yeah, that sounds like a really great program, and sounds like some great training being provided in Montgomery County. It looks like we have a question here in the chat that says, are there many border crossing people coming into Maryland, and are there avenues for those in need in this area to get assistance if needed? I don't know, Jewell, if you want to maybe start speaking about that. I don't know if you've experienced any of that through your work as a navigator.
I am not sure if you mean like border crossing, like into the country, or just border crossing across the state borders. I'll address the state borders. I know that I've personally have experienced, children from other states showing up in Baltimore City as trafficking victims. And we have been able to collaborate with the Interstate Compact to make sure that they are being able to be sent home safely and there is somebody following up with either a service provider or the family or a social worker back in their home state or their home city to make sure that that child continues to receive additional support, and to just also provide them knowledge of maybe what happened on here in Maryland or in Baltimore to that child. I do see that you said country. I personally have not experienced like directly like they were just brought into the country. I know that we do have some families that are from out of the country into Maryland. And like Natalie said, I think that there are options to support them with immigration laws or T visas or U visas, and supporting the family in whichever way they would like to be supported. So sorry, I don't have a direct answer in that experience for myself.
I will say we also don't have a ton of internationally trafficked folks. Our focus really is on the domestic issue. And so state line border crossing is something that we see a lot, just because as far as, despite the Mann Act, most of us were moved around and were expected to move around wherever the money was. So.
I will echo what Beth said in that we're not working directly.
I don't know that one.
We're not working directly with survivors who have crossed the border to come into the US, mainly because we don't have Spanish speaking staff in order to provide services in their native language. But Safe Center, who operates in College Park as well as in Baltimore, does provide a multitude of services, from case management to group programming to legal help, visa help, things like that. And they are a great resource. They are funded through the University of Maryland and the University of Baltimore of Social Work, I believe. I can't be sure on that, but if somebody could drop the link to their website in the chat, that would be a great resource to look to for that issue.
And I will IUTA resource related to Spanish speaking folks.
I was just going to say, I did want to clarify that we do have families from out of the country that live here now that we are supporting and providing services for. But as far as this child has been located or law enforcement has come across a child that maybe was brought in through trafficking from another country, that has not been a case that I have personally experienced. So I just wanted to clarify.
Great. Thank you so much for that, everyone. I think next we have a few people who have some raised hands. So I first want to go to Anna. If you want to unmute Anna Mendez Suarez, you can go ahead and unmute and yeah, share what you wanted to offer to the group.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, how are you? So first off, thank you so much. This was an amazing webinar. I've learned so much. So I really do appreciate the time and for, the presentation. I just wanted to share. So I used to work for Covenant House in New Jersey. I'm not sure how many of you all are aware with Covenant House. They are an amazing organization. They're located in Newark, New Jersey, but they also have a center in Atlantic City, and they're known for to be homeless shelters for youth between the ages of 18 to 21. However, in New Jersey, as of October of 2020, we were awarded a grant that does allow us to work with human trafficking survivors. And so they are an amazing resource. They also have done a lot of work in human trafficking. They've developed certain protocols that are now being used throughout the state to be able to identify whether a client or a youth has been experiencing human trafficking, whether it's currently past experiences that they've had. So I just want to give them a shout out, and definitely encourage you all to reach out to them. And I do have connections there. I can also be a bridge for those connections as well. So that was it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate any new resource or organization that you can connect us with. So if you don't mind dropping that in the chat as well, so that we can have that name written down, that would be super helpful. But thank you again. I think we have another hand raised. So if Valda Rotolo, we can unmute you and you can ask your question or share whatever you wanted to share.
Actually, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but thank you so much for your presentation today.
No worries. Awesome. Well, thank you. Let's see. We had another question in the chat come through. This is for anyone. So it says, how do you avoid compassion fatigue and burnout? Which is a great question, and I'm sure something we've all experienced. So everyone wants to just take a turn to share your experience with that.
Beth, I think it would be great if we started with you and then went around.
Much to say on that topic. Too much to say. But I've done a lot of publishing research that particular area. I worked in DC child welfare for about a decade before coming to academia, and Liz and I and Kyla starting up our programming in January of this year. Well, some of it in October, but officially in January of this year. I mean, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, whatever you want to call it, right? Like subtle differences in those terms in terms of measurement. But I think the concept, the three components of burnout, right? We've got a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So what I do doesn't matter. I'm like, this isn't important. I'm not doing a good job, etc. Right? That emotional exhaustion, which is usually what we think of, where I just like don't have anything else to give. And the most dangerous component is the cynicism or depersonalization of our clients, where we just start checking boxes and not seeing them as people, right? So I will say that is the thing that I really try to keep a finger on the pulse of in supervision. It is really critical for organizations to have this woven into their organizational culture. It's not, I penned an article for Fostering Families recently called The Fallacy of Self-Care, because I just get angry when I hear social workers who are given massive caseloads and no support being told, just do your self-care. A bubble bath won't fix this, right? So, and me going to therapy is not the same thing as my organization taking responsibility for the fact that they are putting a lot on me as a staff member, and therefore in ethical practice, particularly with the social work code of ethics, they have a responsibility to me as their employee to make sure that I have a safe workplace, that I have an environment that is supportive, that I have supervision that is actually doing something beyond criticizing, right? But that is that's addressing my need for social and emotional support in the workplace, right? So that sense that somebody's got my back, that I'm on a team, right? That has that instrumental support. How do I do this? How do I manage all of these things when I'm new? How is orientation handled, staff onboarding, all of that kind of stuff? And then how am I learning clinical and educational stuff as a person who's working in this space, not only for the needs of my clients, but how to manage my stuff in the context of the needs of my clients. And in child welfare, when we would have a child fatality, when we would have a situation with horrible crisis situations in DC child welfare that happen, it has to be all hands on deck. It cannot be that the social worker is alone. And And having experienced that firsthand, being the social worker that was alone in the car in the middle of the night, having to go and get a kid, after experiencing all the stuff that I experienced, I have recognized how dysfunctional that is, but also how unsustainable that is, because a person, particularly somebody right out of grad school, could probably do that for a year, maybe 2 years. Maybe there's a reason that's about how long people tend to stay in child welfare. And I would say other human services have similar issues, youth justice and anti-trafficking. And, we're pulling folks into anti-trafficking spaces that have lived experience. Will multiply that level of risk by at least 2. But think about the fact that any of us that are going into helping professions probably have some kind of trauma history. We probably have some kind of a story that brought us here in the first place, that give us that passion and that fire to want to fight injustice for very little money, right? Like, there's a reason that we're sitting here. And so the risk of secondary traumatization when you have a history of trauma is exponentially higher, particularly if you still have a lot of stuff that you're dealing with, and or if the stuff that you're dealing with is similar to the stuff that you've been through. So, yes, you should have your own support networks. Yes, you should have good education and coping skills to pull from, and therapy and all of these things. But your workplace has an obligation to make sure that you are supported. And if that's not being provided, they should not be surprised if they have high turnover. They should not be surprised if they're not getting the outcome metrics that they want to get with their clients, because the bottom line is a depleted person can only do so much for the people they are serving. So, getting off the soapbox, but that is that. Oh,
That's awesome. Good. Jewell, did you have something to add there?
I just want to say you're absolutely 100% right, Dr. Beth. Being in the space of regional navigator at a CAC, where I'm not just listening to trafficking cases, but I'm also listening to other child abuse cases and assessing for risks of exploitation. It definitely puts you in a space to be overwhelmed and receive that vicarious trauma. But I have absolutely had amazing supervision here, colleagues that provide a space for me to debrief, to take a breath. And I've also learned to hold that space for my colleagues as well, by instead of just going and dumping all the things that I'm feeling, I ask them, do you have the capacity to hear what I'm about to say right now? Is that okay? Is it okay if I talk to you about this really traumatizing case? And that keeps everybody in the same type of headspace to be able to support and lean on each other, and keeps me healthy for my team, so that I can provide a space for them. So you're absolutely 100% right, Dr. Beth. It does. The workplace makes a big impact.
I'll add very little, but first of all, I'm so fortunate that Dr. Beth is my supervisor, because she makes it incredibly easy to do the work that I do. The only thing I can really think to add is to know yourself. I've done a lot of different things in the anti-trafficking world, and all of them I've loved. But the only thing I truly wake up happy to do day in and day out is programming. And not in the programming sense of like case management, crisis intervention, peer support. I love group programming. It's kind of like you should go into nursing because you love nursing, right? Nobody wants a nurse who hates their job. Nobody wants to be with someone who doesn't want to be there. So knowing yourself, knowing what you want to be doing, I think is like the key component. Because even on hard days, even when things get out of whack, or somebody has a crisis, or somebody doesn't like you, knowing that you love what you're doing is so important. I have a list of things that I hold dear, mainly boundaries. I don't check my email after I've signed off for the day unless it's really important. And often if it's really important, it's not coming through as an email, right? I take scheduled breaks throughout the day. On days that I go to jail, I take time before to kind of meditate or pray or whatever I feel is necessary to do. And then if something happens at jail, the first thing I'm going to do right after I get out of there is I'm going to call Dr. Beth and I'm going to tell her this is what happened. You know, I don't know if I need advice or I just need to dump this. And then I'm going to refer to Kyla, who's our DC regional navigator, who I know can also provide that support. And like Jewell said, I'm going to ask, can you take this right now? Can you hold this for me right now? Because everybody should have consent in that way. And then, yeah, I think of self-care as not the bubble bath and the, you know, taking time to read a book. I do think of those things when I think of self-care, but self-care for me means actually going to therapy or taking my meds in the morning or going for the walk that I don't quite want to go to, but need to get up and move my body. So having all of these components in place are really important. If all of that is there and you're still experiencing compassion burnout or compassion fatigue, you know, it's not a moral failing to say, I need a break. I need to regroup. I need to revive my emotional capacity. And if you come back from that and you're still dealing with it, then maybe it's time to rethink what you're doing. Because the last thing you want is to harm someone out of that fatigue. And then cause further trauma to someone who's experienced something horribly horrific. So yeah, that was all of the input I had for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, all of you. That was a great response. And I couldn't agree more. The importance of having an organization behind you that understands what vicarious trauma is and the need for that response and space. So I really appreciate you all sharing about that. We have a bit of time left, so I wonder if we can have a few more questions. If anybody has any questions, keep putting them in the chat. We probably have time for one or two more. But I'm wondering, I know you all kind of touched on this a bit. If you could speak a little bit more just about the importance of collaboration across programs to your work. I know we all have a lot of connections within this field and just how you see the importance of collaborating in different programs and in different organizations in your work.
I'd be happy to touch on that first. When Dr. Beth and I were dreaming up what the Restoring Ivy would become, we landed hard on the idea that we did not want to have a brick and mortar because we wanted to have community partnership be the core piece of the work that we do. And so we're only able to do our programming if people bring us into their organizations and allow us to use their space and allow us access to their clients. And of course, like the programming and the data that will come of that is incredible and awesome. But what's really incredible for me personally is that we're showing that these partnerships can be cohesive, that they can be solution oriented, that they can be collaborative, and kind of knocking the whole trafficking field on its axis and showing that partnership is not only doable, but needed and really kind of like not necessary. Like it needs to be standard. It needs to be the way that all organizations are operating. And so I really love that the Restoring Ivy is showing that to the DMV and Baltimore area, because in doing so, we could see a radical shift in the way that all of anti-trafficking work is done.
I mean, the fact is that this work can't be done by one type of service provider. It just can't. It's impossible. So, you know, we have to collaborate, we have to speak, we have to connect in order to make real impact and real change. For example, like Natalie stated earlier, I supervise the Anti-Trafficking and Exploitation program at the CAC in Baltimore City. We service ages 0 to 24. Oftentimes they come to my attention through DSS or through a forensic interview. However, that 22-year-old is not going to come to my attention through DSS. So by partnering with law enforcement, by having those relationships, by having that rapport and that community, sense of community, somebody from one of those other sectors can reach out to me and say, hey, Jewell, we have a client, we have a survivor, and we really want to make sure that her, him, or they and their family are okay and that they are receiving the services that they need. Communication across the board is absolutely needed. And without it, we would be doing our families and a disservice. So, you know, I love what you said, Liz, just about it being community centered. It's important across the board.
And just adding to that, I think the idea that where you find survivors can be any of these places. And so, you know, we are aiming to create destigmatized spaces wherever we go. And essentially using that survivor peer-led je ne sais quoi that we bring with us, right, along with the other evidence-based practice stuff. It creates the space where we can say, listen, like, you know, I have this lived experience. I've been through some of this stuff, like, and it isn't once a hoe, always a hoe, because, like, I mean, it doesn't have to define your life. The worst thing that happened to you doesn't define who you are. So, you know, if we are able to partner effectively with shelters, with schools, with child welfare, with juvenile justice, with jail, whatever, we're able to go into spaces where we know survivors are and reduce some of that stigma just by being there.
That's great. Yeah. We had another question come through that kind of is piggybacking off of this one. But it says, along those lines, are there any tips for collaborating with law enforcement? As was mentioned earlier, there's training in Montgomery County, but it can be tricky. So do you have any tips from your work in the field for working specifically with law enforcement?
I've probably participated in a dozen trainings for law enforcement over the course of the decade that I've been doing this work. What I've learned is that there are people who are really good at speaking that language that law enforcement culture has. I'm not one of those people. So I think this is a great opportunity to spotlight the idea that people have their lane, and I think people who do really well at those trainings should be supported and highlighted and, you know, given reference to as often as possible. But when I think back on the most successful trainings that I did, and by success I mean the energy, the engagement that I got. I think those were best done in partnership with other law enforcement partners who were able to kind of act as interpreters because oftentimes the language that I use versus the language that they use is going to be different. And so having that bridge, that partner who's able to provide that bridge is really important. And then, you know, kind of leaning into what's already available. There's a ton of material that can be accessed on the internet, including the Blue campaign through the Homeland Security Toolkit library. And there's actually a lot of really comprehensive, really easy to digest material through their website and their content. And that's a great place to get started. And then reaching out to those that provide those trainings, like Safe Center, Turnaround, and CASA. Those people and places and organizations that have that kind of capacity are really important to lean on, because they're able to provide those trainings in ways that, you know, like the Restoring Ivy really doesn't have the capacity to provide. And I think that's all I have on that.
I would say relationship building and really just getting to know your law enforcement partners has been really helpful. I have found if you are unable to get in direct contact with the detective on a specific case or sergeant on a specific case, maybe start with the victim advocate for that unit or the liaison. One of the first people I met coming into this role was the Baltimore Police Department human trafficking victim advocate. You know, there is somebody oftentimes that we may not even know within that law enforcement sector who does have that advocacy mindset. So building those relationships, inviting them to the conversations and not just saying, I think all the time, like, you need training, you need education. It's also, I want to hear and see your point of view as well and get, you know, hear what you have to say, and then let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. Let's really discuss how we can best support each other and support this family in a way that is lucrative and effective, efficient.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I think that's really great advice. Relationship building is so important in all the work we do, but especially with working with partners. So yeah, definitely great advice. We're coming close to the end here, but I think we have time for one more question. I wonder if you could both just talk about how you envision the passage and now it's going to into effect of Safe Harbor impacting your work and your different fields.
I'm like waiting for Liz. I am not excited to see more trafficking cases, but I am excited to be aware, to know that the families will be able to receive services and support. I am hopeful that by this law coming into effect on October 1st, that, you know, I will continue to be privy to maybe some of these, you know, survivors or victims that fell through the cracks because they weren't supported due to policy and legislation. I think it's important for us to provide that support and that service to as many people as we are able to reach and who want to be reached. So I'm hopeful that maybe I will be able to have more conversations, continue to learn, more resources continue to pop up because we're able to sit and discuss, you know, the needs that are there. And yeah, I'm hoping that it's a really positive impact for our survivors.
Yeah, Jewell, I wanted to let you go first on that one because you're a regional navigator, and I felt like you would have a really great answer on like that direct impact. For the Restoring Ivy Collective, we're not going to see quantitative impact data for a while, mainly because we don't offer crisis services, right? So the ways that I feel Safe Harbor will impact our work is, I think of my own experience as a survivor in that I didn't self-identify as a survivor until 8 years after it happened or had ended. And like Beth mentioned, once a hoe, always a hoe mentality, like we really internalized that, right? And so it was through a magazine article about other survivors that I even self-identified. It was like, this is my story, but this isn't how I frame it. And so the impact I think Safe Harbor will have is that through the intervention of Safe Harbor itself, through the attachment and the diversion into the regional Navigator system, all of that will help survivors be able to identify right off the bat that they're survivors. And then hopefully we'll see an influx of people that we're serving in our programming because they've identified as a survivor and know that they're eligible for our services. Another way that I think my work will be impacted is that the public will have more awareness and knowledge about the issue of trafficking, but specifically the issue of children being trafficked. Because we have a lot of societal biases and outdated ideas about what trafficking looks like, who trafficking survivors are, and how they should be treated. And so hopefully we'll see a societal shift and our work will be made easier by the fact that society itself isn't bogging us down with misinformation.
That's great. Well, thank you all for everything that you had to share today. This was super informative. I know I learned a lot and just really appreciated the wealth of experience that you all brought to the table and your willingness to share that with all of us here today. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm just going to turn it over to Alyssa for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you to all of our presenters again for this great information. I would like to direct everyone's attention to the chat. I posted the evaluation form. If everyone can please take a moment to make sure you fill out this form, we'd greatly appreciate any feedback you have as we're constantly striving to improve our training programs. As a reminder, you'll also need to fill out this form if you want any CEU credits or certificate of attendance. Additionally, you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording from today's webinar and the evaluation form if you miss it in the chat. Thank you again for joining.